In this video, we're going to look at yet another way of being able to lay your pages out and move elements from one place to another using the float. Float-based layouts take advantage of the float property to position elements side by side and create columns on a web page. Also allows you to move one element to one side of the page or its containing block or the other, either right or left. Any HTML below the floated element moves up on the page and wraps around the float. The float property accepts the values of left, floating it to the left, right, to float it to the right, none, that it doesn't float at all, or inherit, where it would inherit it from its parent if that value was set for it as well. Vertical margins will not be collapsed, as I talked about a couple weeks ago, either above or below it, the way block boxes do in a normal flow. This is primarily because when it's floated, just like the absolute and the fixed, it's taken out of the context of the page itself so that everything flows up above it and it's not in direct contact with those block level elements. Floated box is actually aligned with the top of its containing box or containing block. So let's take a look at a simple one here, and we just have an H1 with an aside in it that has a class of pull quote and then a couple paragraphs along with it. In our CSS, you'll see that we've put a border around the body, color of black with a background color of white, and said a few other things, but you can see the border, and both the paragraph tags have a border as well. Well, we're dealing with the float, so in the aside that has the pull quote, we're going to float it to the right and then set the width of it, because all floated items should have the width set. Without that, it just expands to the width of the browser window. So you always want to set the width. The other two that I have there, we're going to come back to in just a few minutes. So you can see it here then. You can see the border around the body that we talked about, the H3 in here, the two paragraph tags with the borders that you see here, and that aside tag that was floated is sitting over here on the right side. It appears as if it's inside of this paragraph, but basically it's right below this H1 element. It just happened to have ended up on top of this paragraph. This paragraph came after the aside, so everything here then just wrapped up alongside of it, just filled the space. Now, because of the way this is laid out, there's obviously a few problems. You can see that there's very little space at the top. The two L's are on top of the border here, and there's very little space here as well. So usually it's a good idea to add some padding or margin around it when you do float it. In our CSS then, the two things that I had X'd out in order to make this look the way we would want it to, and the book doesn't look right because they don't even talk about this. The book assumes that the aside is another paragraph tag. But anyway, with those fixes then, we refresh the page. You can see now that there's space around everything and it's more readable. It's much easier to also see how the text of the paragraph has just flown up and to the left of it. So it just filled in the space that was voided by this. If we just used the align right for this, like you would do with an image element, then none of this would have wrapped alongside of it. Sometimes you don't want the content to move up next to it, like I just showed you, such as a copyright. You probably want to keep the copyright on the bottom of the page as opposed to having it float up and alongside of other content. In a 2 or 3 column design, if the main column is shorter than either of the floated sidebars, a footer then that had the copyright in it could move up and around the left floated column. If you float one or more elements inside a non-floated containing element, and the floated element is taller than the other content inside the tag, it will stick out of the bottom of the enclosing element. It says tag, but we should be talking element there. So to prevent this wrapping or to stop the wrapping of content, you can use the clear property. This property can be used on any element, has four possible values. The left means the content of the element with the clear property is cleared from the left side of a float. The right, the content of the element with the clear property is cleared from the right side of a float. Both means the content of the element with the clear property is cleared from either side of a float. And then none just allows it to flow like it normally would on either side. Take a look at this example again. We pretty much have the same thing here, the aside with the pull quote, two paragraph tags above that. And in here we have the pull quote still floating it right with 150. Notice that the paragraph tag though now has a clear right. Well, if we look at this in our browser, you see then that instead of wrapping up, this has not wrapped up the way it did in the other example. You can see that this is not wrapped up alongside of the pull quote like it did in the last example. It was prohibited from doing that because of the clear property. So you can create actual layouts with the float as well. To create a two-column layout, you would wrap each column in a divider tag with an ID or a class attribute that you might use for styling. Float the sidebar divider either right or left, whichever side you want that small column to be on. The source order, or the order of the HTML code, is important here. It's important because the content that's going to wrap up or float alongside of this has to come after it. When you float it then, as I said before, you would set the width for a floated window. Should be fixed using pixels or EMs. You can use a percentage, but use it with caution. Test it, make sure it looks the way you want it to. Then add a left margin to the main content. That would keep the content from wrapping under the floated element if it's longer than the sidebar itself. So a couple samples here of what you would do. Again, on the left hand side is the HTML source order, the order that the HTML is actually written, and then the layout that we're trying to get here. So again, do we need to move the banner? No, because it's right where we want it to. Do we need to move the sidebar? No, we don't need to move it, but we need to pull it over to the side. So we float that to the left. Once we float that to the left, then this main content wraps around the side of it and ends up in this space. Now, as you see in this example, the body is actually, the content is longer than the sidebar. If that's true, or it's going to be true, then you need to set the left margin to keep it from coming back into the box that I have drawn now. Because without setting that margin, as soon as it would clear this very end of that sidebar, this content would wrap inside of here then. It would wrap underneath of it. The second example here is pretty much the same, only this time we're going to take that sidebar, float it to the right, let the main content flow up on the left side of it, and again set the right margin this time so that it doesn't come back underneath of the sidebar. And then the third one, all we've done to this was added a wrapper around it, a divider tag or whatever you might use, and gave it a fixed width. These, as they are, would fill the entire page, the first two examples, and then you would proceed the same way as you just did. And then you proceed with the same steps that I just talked about in either one of the first two examples. Well, you could also do the same thing with a three-column layout. You just add another divider between the two columns, take the left sidebar, float it to the left, take the right sidebar, float it to the right, and then the content will fill the space in between. Here though, you would have to put not only the left margin, but you'd also have to set the right margin to keep the content from wrapping back underneath either of the sidebars. Now the one downside of doing it this way is that you've got a lot of content before you get to the main content. So any indexing spiders that are out there are going to read all this right and left sidebar for indexing purposes before they get to the content. So you want to keep that in mind if you decide to use this type of layout. Now, in one of the other modules, we'll actually do layout using floats as well as positioning. And you'll see exactly how all this works. As a matter of fact, it uses relative positioning, absolute positioning, as well as floats in it to lay different parts of the page out. So make sure you look at that module.